Hello and welcome to another video podcast. Please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the channel, or check out James Photography on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. In this video, I'm chatting to Daniel George from Honour and Arms HMB Club in Rochdale Greater Manchester. Daniel is the owner of Honour and Arms HMB Club and is also the current captain of the Northern Wolves medieval combat team. During the interview, Daniel speaks passionately and authoritatively about his love for the sport of medieval combat. If you ever wondered what the difference is between HEMA and Buhurt, then this highly enjoyable and informative interview is for you. So let's jump straight into the video. Hello, Daniel.
Hello.
Hello, Daniel. Right. In the introduction, I gave a little bit about you, but I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit more and the viewers a little bit about your club and what it is.
Yeah, so as you'll have heard in the introduction, I'm Daniel George. I'm the owner of Honour and Arms HMB Club, based here in Whitworth in Rochdale. HMB stands for Historical Medieval Battle. But strictly historical fencing, historical wrestling styles, and historical medieval battle as a sport is what we do at the club. I'm also the captain of the Northern Wolves HMB team, which I was voted in on earlier this year, beginning of this year as the captain, with a view to obviously taking that team, developing the team, bringing newer fighters in, given that I'm coaching as well at my club, to develop the sport, develop the team, and obviously, further the sport in the Northwest.
So we'll get more into Northern Wolves and all that, but could you tell us about the sport specifically? I mean, what is it? Because there'll be people watching that won't know anything about it.
Yeah, so HMB's a very specific term when we talk about historical medieval battle. We're probably best using a broader overarching term of something like full contact medieval combat or medieval combat sports, because there are different disciplines that fall under that kind of generalised banner. Within the sport, we've got dueling disciplines, we've got group fight disciplines, and we've got pro fight disciplines. All of it's done in armour, so as medieval knights would have worn. And dependent on the rule set or the discipline that you're doing, depends on the aim or the goal, and the aim depends on what you're actually doing. Dueling, it's typically points scored over a certain period of time, number of rounds. Pro fights, again, is points scored over a number of rounds, but it mixes in different techniques. So there is grappling and wrestling techniques, ground fighting, as well as sword, shield, striking techniques. And then the group fights, the Buhurt side of things, is purely on a kind of last man standing basis. So the aim of the game is to get your opponents, your team of opponents, to the ground, to take them out of the fight and win that way. So you're not reenactment? No.
You don't dress up on a Sunday and just pretend to be battling?
No, we are a sport. So there's a specific designed or defined set of parameters and rules with an outcome in mind. So we're not reenacting the Battle of Tewkesbury, where the outcome has already been determined and we're recreating that as a living history aspect. This is competitive combat sports. There's no predetermined winners. We go out there, we fight hard with a view to obviously determining who's the best on the day, whether that be the dueling disciplines, the pro fights or the group fights.
So although you're not reenactment, you have an historical bent in what you wear and what you...
Yeah, that's right. So there's two major organisations worldwide, shall we say, that our sport falls under. We've got the IMCF, which is International Medieval Combat Federation, and we've also got the HMBIA, which is the Historical Medieval Battle International Association. And they have predefined rule sets, both of which cover, not only weapon requirements and armour requirements, but authenticity, historicity, that we have to abide by. So under the HMB rule set, for example, your actual harness, your armour, is not allowed to span more than a 30-year period. And you've got to have demonstrable sources, whether that be effigies, whether it be extant examples in museums, to call upon, basically. There's quite a lot of good guidance out there at the moment with respect to what is good and what goes together within a particular time period. But you wouldn't see people using, a 13th century helm with a 15th, 16th century full plate, for example. It needs to be within that defined set of parameters.
Okay, no one's Doctor Who, they can't just move around,
no.
Time travel.
No.
So is there a beginning period and an ending period?
Typically what we focus on is the period for which Buhurt and tournament combat was prevalent in history. So we're talking 12th and 13th century, mainly 13th century, through to around about the 16th, 17th century at the latest. Most of the period of equipment that you'll see is 13th, 14th, and some 15th century. So that's kind of where we sit in terms of the armour, the combat. And that ties in with kind of the historical sources that we've got from literary accounts and obviously modern day reviews, books and literature on tournament combat, foot combat, Buhurt, as we've said.
I'm going to ask you now. You've said that a few times. Buhurt.
Buhurt, yes.
Go on. Where's that from, and what's that?
So it's an old word. It's been changed over the years. So you've got Buhurt, which is Bohort, Buhort, Buhurt, Buhurt, and a whole array between. Mainly Old Germanic and Old French, the word evolved from. Typically, it was earlier in the centuries, though. So we're talking 12th and 13th century where that word was originated to kind of determine an informal combat tournament, if you will. There's an account, 1288 in Boston, I believe, where the Buhurt word is used. So Boston in the UK, which was effectively a kind of informal combat between squires at the time, and knights were excluded. It was only the squires that were competing against one another in their martial prowess. So historically, we've got that as an early misnomer. We use it obviously for the benefit of the sport as a whole. As we go through time and we look at the literary sources, that probably changes to, past arm, French word for feats of combat in effect, mêlée à pied, so foot combat specifically for what we do. Foot combat as it's known in English, fighting at the barriers, as it evolved over time. So as the tournament evolved, the vocabulary that we used evolved with it. But Buhurt is synonymous with what we do in terms of the full contact medieval combat.
So if any of the viewers get interested, they can easily just put in Buhurt.
Yeah, if you Google Buhurt, Buhurt, that will throw up a majority of links that link to this sport, and then you'll end up going down the rabbit hole with numerous links, numerous sources.
So you've mentioned reading literature. Is that treatises?
Yeah, so we've got treatises for armoured combat through history. But what we've also got is literary accounts that have been reviewed. So we've got, for example, scholars of the day documenting the feats of arms that their champions would have done. There's some great resources with respect to tournaments. So, for example, David Crouch did a book called Tournament. It focuses on from roughly the 1100s to around about the 1400s, which gives a good history of the tournament overall. And then you've got other sources such as there's one specifically by Viscount Dillon, which is in the Archaeological Data Report from 1904, where he specifically references and goes into foot combat and at the barriers, or barriers and foot combat, I believe it's known as. And that goes through literary accounts from the 14th and 15th century of people attending single combats, duels, both for sport and for judicial reasons, as well as other combat on foot where, there were people meeting and doing 3v3 combats. They'd challenge all comers and they would fight anybody to prove their martial prowess, build a name. So yeah, there's a lot of that out there. It's good reading because it ties us back to what we do as a sport in a sense that we know that it happened. We know that there were fighters, knights, squires that were out to make a name for themselves. And in a time when there wasn't war, the easiest way to do that was to tourney or to compete in combat, go to tournaments, win prizes, win the fame, build a name for themselves, a reputation. William Marshall, a little bit earlier, is probably a prime example. He was probably one of the most famous tourneyers, not a very rich knight, but one that would do very, very well in tourneys, capture a lot of knights, ransom a lot of things, and earn a living. So, yeah.
I've heard of him.
Earl of Pembroke.
Right. Vaguely gone back way back. Because, as the viewers will know, I study HEMA, which is slightly different.
Yeah.
In HEMA, although we wear padded equipment, we don't. It's not full contact, or it's not supposed to be. We're supposed to be training as though we're unarmoured, and it's just protective gear that we wear
to facilitate.
Yeah.
So you, within HEMA, you've got the bloss fetching side, which is your unarmoured side, haven't you? And then you've got the harness fetching side, which is armoured combat, the manuals that teach that. We as a sport slightly differ in that the modern rules that we fight under have removed certain elements to keep us safe. Thrusts, for example, very familiar thing in HEMA. Get straight to the point, if you will. Whereas, with respect to what we do, we're going out there to compete and win. But if we were to thrust with any of these weapons, we would potentially really, really hurt someone. So that element has been removed. Now, we know that actually happened in history as well. You know, there are manuals out there specifically from the late 13th century through to the mid 15th century that take a different spin on how you can keep the knight safe. Because early days, many knights were getting wounded, fatally in some instances, at these tournaments. So certain things were put in place to enable them not to. So still compete, still fight, still make a name for themselves, but not kill themselves and or others in the process.
Yeah, because a knight knocked out is a knight less for the army, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And, you know, unfortunately, the tournament was a spectacle, you know, and there is a book by the Royal Armouries, The Tournament as a Spectacle, which is a great read that covers everything. But it was a spectacle. It was done not at times of war. It was done to, you know, like I said, allow the nobility to kind of prove the martial prowess, have fun, get everybody together. It was kind of the social gathering of the day. So they had to introduce rules to ensure that was, you know, you weren't taking out the nobility as a subsequence.
So you mentioned squires. I mean, they obviously didn't fight together because of a class system, but I didn't realise squires were trained as well.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, a squire was a knight in training. So that knight or that squire may well have been working with his knight, his man at arms, his knight, from the age of 8, 9, 10 years old, learning the craft of what being a knight was. So the chivalry side of things, the martial side of things. And they would work with a knight. They would help armour a knight. They would repair a knight's armour. They would ride to battle with the knights. You know, they would help within every aspect of that knight's life until they got of an age where they were deserving enough to become a knight of their own, which was typically around about, I believe, 21 or so.
And that's a knight, not a man of arms. It's an actual...
Yeah.
You've been knighted?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
I thought that would be a class system. You wouldn't be able to climb that ladder. But
squires typically were the children of senior nobility. So if they were on the path to become a knight, they would be taken in by another knight, potentially of the time, the class, an association of their father or the family, and they would get trained up in the knightly ways.
Let's just delve into then. So you're a knight on the field. Are you wearing exactly the same thing that they would have wore?
In most instances, yes. The things that really, really differ is obviously we've got modern metallurgy. So whilst they would have been dealing with obviously what steel that they were able to produce at the time, because we're in current times and because we're modern, we do have alternatives. So for example, not only do you have hardened spring steels, which they would have dealt with, we've also got stainless steels that we can use. We've got titanium, for example, nowadays that people do make armour and harnesses out of. But that's for the sport context. In terms of the look, in terms of the protection, the majority of it will be historical and period. The only thing that we don't wear typically is supplemental chainmail. Obviously, this has chainmail on it, this helmet, and that's for authenticity reasons. But you won't see me wearing a mail hauberk underneath my brigandine and my arms or anything of that nature, because we're not worried about the thrusts because we've removed them.
So you've not got broadheads coming towards you or lances or anything like that, yeah. No. And no one's after you with like a rondel trying to finish you off.
No, that's it. So within the context of the sport, especially in the group side of things, when we're talking about the Buhurt group categories, 5v5s, 12v12s, the minute anything other than your feet touch the floor, you are considered out. Now, with respect to the rules, if you're in the middle of throwing someone, so you're in a grapple with someone, you throw them and a hand touches the floor in that momentary exchange, you're allowed to stand back up and carry on in the fight. But if it happens before, or 2 delayed thereafter, then you would be considered down.
So that's 5-men teams and 12-men teams.
Yeah, and 30-men teams.
30-men teams.
Yeah.
So that is a real battle.
Yeah, so the categories that we have, depending on the rule set in the organisation, as I mentioned before, if we talk HMB, 3v3, 5v5, 12v12, 30 versus 30. And then at the World Championships in 2019, they did an experimental category of 150 versus 150. So that was 5 columns, if you will, of 30 on either side.
I'm just, that's amazing. That I mean, referees, marshals.
Yeah, so we refer to them as marshals. So they're trained in the rules of the sport, obviously demonstrated the knowledge, and that enables them obviously to, 1, keep track of the action, but 2, keep people safe as well. So they're not only controlling the pace of the fight, breaking anything that's unsafe, stopping the fight if somebody's injured, but also looking out for things like armour failures. So where a piece of equipment has, come loose from a point, or a rivet in an arm or a leg or something has failed due to a strike, they're sitting people down for their own safety.
So, but how do you stop, I mean, the heat of the battle, red mist, how do you stop someone having a grudge and really hurting the opponent?
So if we take the 5v5s, because that's probably the easiest context to control, you would have 4 line marshals. So if you think the list is a rectangular structure, so in effect, each line marshal outside the list has a quarter that they control on the outside. And then within the list, you have 2, typically 3 field marshals. So you have 1 night marshal who's in charge, 2 marshals that will assist him in the list, and then 4 on the outside watching from the line. They intervene by using a yellow flag on the end of a very long stick.
To keep out of the way?
Yeah. Obviously, as you can imagine, when you've got these helmets on, you can hear and you can see very well. There's a misconception that you probably couldn't, but you can. The problem being is when you're very close to people, you're in close quarters, you're fighting hand to hand, it can be very, very difficult if someone's shouting at you to discern a marshal from your teammate or from your opposition. So the yellow flags on the end of the stick need to come in effectively in front of the visor. As soon as we see that, we know that that is a marshal telling us to either stop or break for one reason or another. We stop immediately at that point.
Because you're not enemies,
No, not at
you're
all.
Enjoying the sport.
Yeah, it's competitive. I think, we've got the sport aspect where we're in there and we are fighting tooth and nail to win. But then you've got the family aspect of it. Everybody outside of the list, if you will, after we've done knocking lumps out of one another, are very cordial, very friendly. And you've got that atmosphere of people. You've got a community, if you will. It is a community of very special individuals.
So there's a nice social side to it.
There is, yeah.
Yeah. So let's just keep on this this track of it for the teams, because I'm interested. So if you've got 5 people or 12 or whatever, do they all do exactly the same thing, or they got specialisms?
Not necessarily. I mean, each team will typically try and play to the strengths of the individual. You'll have some people that are more suited to being runners, for example, that are very fleet of foot. They're able to find a gap, break through a line, attack people from behind, blindside people. Or you'll have other people that are, they're stronger in terms of a grapple. So they're happy to get involved up close and personal with their opponents, hold people, try and gain an advantage by taking somebody down. And obviously we've got different weapons as well, which changes the dynamic of how you fight. So we've got pole weapons like halberds, that are 3.5 kilos in weight, 2.2 meters long. We've got falchions, similar to this one. So this is my falchion. So this falchion's roughly 85 centimeters long, 1.5 kilos. We've got maces, again, very, very similar. So this mace is 50 centimeters long. So obviously, depending on what weapon you've got, and combination of whether you're using a sword and a shield, or a mace and a shield, or a halberd where you've got no shield, will dictate how you can actually fight somebody. And that does take precedence. People have their own preferences, and you tend to try and play to people's strong suits within the fight. So if you know somebody is a very strong wrestler, specifically on the list, so if they're against the list and they're very strong at wrestling with that rail and that barrier there, you wouldn't want to put them in the middle. You'd want them to play to their strengths. So it can be tactical in that respect as well.
So you know your team and you would put them in those positions and you would play to your strengths.
Ideally, that's what you want to do, because at the end of the day, we want to win.
So you've researched the other team as well?
Yeah, I mean, especially in the UK, we're very familiar with all the other, all the other teams that we'd compete against in the UK on a regular basis. Domestically, I think at the moment we've probably got 7 or 8 male teams. I think we've got around 3 or 4 female teams, potentially 5, because there is a new one that's just come out of Glasgow. So, we get familiar with those opponents. We know to a degree what people are strong at and what maybe not so much. And we do all train together as well. So not only do we have our own domestic clubs, but a lot of the domestic clubs feed into the national team or are available for selection, which means national training where you're training with these individuals from other clubs, which is good because you get the exposure there. It's a whole different ball game when you then go abroad and you start fighting teams from France and you're fighting teams from, Germany or Poland, because those individuals you're not familiar with. So you have to then rely on what you're good at and what your team's good at and hope that on the day when you're fighting, that kind of pushes its way to the fore and you're able to win through.
It's like any martial art, though, isn't it? The more you train with other schools, with other teams, you pick up things, don't you? Yeah, little things. It's great. So teams of 5, teams of 12. Is it just a mass melee, disorganised? Or, especially when you're the 150 as well.
Yeah, that was very organised.
Were they regimented?
Yeah, very much so. So the 150 was organised into effectively 5 blocks of 30 fighters in each, on either side. Like
some sort of pike square, but obviously not with pikes.
Yeah, in effect. So there were a lot of halberds involved in that one. So as you can imagine, when you think about a pitch line battle where 2 forces are kind of converging on one another, we've not got the pikes because we're not thrusting and we're not trying to stab. But halberds and axes attacking from overhead, taking people down, pulling people behind the line to effectively dispatch them, bring them out of the fight.
And dispatch them, is that getting them on the back?
Getting them on the floor, yeah.
Is it on the back, on the stomach, or just on the floor?
Anything. So other than your feet as it was. The rules changed in January to incorporate that third point of contact just for the hand during and immediately after the throw, for the grapple side of things. But yeah, as it was in 2019, it was if you got somebody off their feet, they were considered out.
I've got so many questions as you're going along, but most of the people watching this will either be HEMA related or maybe from your community as well. Can you just tell us what is a halberd?
Yeah, so a halberd is effectively a long pole weapon. They are used in HEMA. I've seen plenty of HEMA practitioners using them, rubberized, of course, on the end of a wooden stick. Obviously, within HEMA, with the modern fencing masks and the padded jackets, anything too heavy, because it's concussive, it would be dangerous. But yeah, typically a pole weapon, 2 to 2.5 meters long, an axe on one side, either a hammerback or a spike on the other, and then typically like a spike on the front. So it's kind of a triple weapon. You'd have an axe blade on one side, you'd have a spike on the front for thrusting, and you'd have either a hammer and or another spike on the back.
So you would still have those 3 points? Because
so we don't have the top point, so we don't have the top spike. We don't have the back spike, but we're allowed the hammer, but we're not allowed to hit with the hammer. So we're allowed it for aesthetic reasons, but from a marshalling perspective, if you hit anybody with a hammer back of an axe, you get red carded, that's you.
Right, and that's simply because the weight, the impact weight of a hammer compared to the blade of the halberd.
Yeah, I mean, getting hit with a 3.5 kilo halberd isn't fun. We go out there and we do it, and the equipment that we wear is good, and it's designed so that you don't get killed. But getting hit with one is no fun regardless, especially if you're in a kind of constrained environment. So if you're in the middle of grappling somebody and someone's free and they run over and hit you when you don't expect it, or whilst their teammates got a hold of you in a vulnerable position, it is not a fun place to be.
So we're delving into safety now then. These look like formidable weapons. They're not sharp in any way.
No, not at all.
And like HEMA, do they flex?
They flex a little bit, but because we're not thrusting, you'll find that especially these weapons like this falchion are much more rigid. So this one, it does have a distal taper, so it is thicker towards the hilt than it is towards the point, but it's still got to be a minimum of 2 mil thick at the end. So the edge has to be 2 mil thick all the way through. So it is very rigid. I mean, you see me trying to bend that, it doesn't really go much.
And what is that made out of?
This is just hardened spring steel.
Okay.
So it's made exactly as a falchion would be. If I took a grinder to it and I sharpened the edge, it would cut like any other sword would. It's no different in that respect, other than we leave the edge rebated specifically because of the fact that it can't be too thin.
Okay, so that balance-wise and everything is a falchion, basically. It's just not, it's not sharp.
Slightly heavier. We're within the parameters of what we can do. Our falchions can go up to 1.8 kilos. So we have an upwards error allowance. So it's 1.7 plus 100 grams for single-handed weapons. This one that I've brought is around about 1.5, so just over 3 pounds, which if you compared it to a historical example of a falchion would be heavy. But then again, we've left it thick because we have a minimum edge thickness. If we were to grind that off and, like we said, taper it to an edge, it probably would come in there or thereabouts to what a historical analogue would.
So you mentioned the weight. Is that part of a team? Do you have to have all these weapons at a specific weight?
Yeah, so we come back to safety on this point. So the weapons have to be within specific parameters. One, to level the playing field so that everybody's not using something that's too light or too heavy, for that matter, especially when we're talking about the big pole weapons. But within those parameters, you can basically define what you want in terms of your weapon. So this falchion, not only do I use it in the groups, but it's also what we refer to, or I refer to, is pro fight spec, which means it has to have a specific weapon coefficient within the pro fight rules. So what that means is that the balance point from the guard, which on this particular piece is around about 18 and 19 centimetres, is measured times by the weight and 5 centimetres added, and it has to have a weapon coefficient which is above 30. What that means is I'm not using a weapon that's too light. Now, I can use a weapon that's got a coefficient of 35, 40, but my opponent has to have a weapon that's a minimum of 30 as well in the pro fights to level the playing field. We also have minimum weights. So for falchions, the minimum weight is 1.3 kilos. So we don't use any lighter than that. Same for the arming swords, 1.3 kilos.
So simply, why not lighter? I mean, because you still got hit, you're not stabbing, so there's no in the bind or anything like that.
Yeah, no, there's none of that. I mean, specifically, there's a lower element purely because of the fact that we want to try and build people to use weapons as they were. If you look at historical examples, if you look at a historical example of a falchion, for example, you wouldn't find one that's probably less than 1.3 kilos. Similar to arming swords, a kilo to 1.3, 1.4, dependent on obviously the type, the manufacturer, the hilt type, the pommel, etc. So the minimum parameters are there for a reason. With maces, these aren't allowed to be more than a kilo. And that's purely because these were designed to concuss.
Because that's like the hammer on the back of the Halberd.
So maces, from a safety aspect, within the sport, there is a maximum weight on these of a kilo, in effect. So that weighs around about 900 grams. When you take it in the hand, it feels hefty because all the weight is here. If it was any more than that, it could potentially become dangerous. These rules are there for a reason. Like we said, depending on what you're using, whether you're using a one-handed weapon, such as a falchion or an axe, or you're using a two-handed pole weapon, or a Majikovsky Bible falchion, a big two-handed falchion, there are parameters that we've got to stick within to make sure that everybody's safe.
Two-handed falchion, is that like a long sword? Or?
Yeah, I mean, you've got long swords, as you would think, but there's specific examples of two-handed falchions, which are, if you can imagine this, scaled up probably by 5, so the blade is much thicker and broader. It's much longer. It has a guard on it that enables you to hold it effectively like a halberd or like a longsword, big two-handed, to cleave. You can use those as well, providing that they fit within the parameters.
And what about something like a montante, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, again, as long as it fits within the definitions of a long weapon, weight-wise, length-wise, or within a pole weapon or, a two-hander, if you will. So the definition is one-handed weapons, long weapons, obviously maces and axes, and then you've got pole arms, if you will, two-handed weapons. So a montante or a zweihander could be used, and people do use them in the sport, fleetingly, but some of them do use them in the sport, as long as they fit within the parameters. So whenever we do a tournament, no matter where that tournament is, there's always a weapons check. Or the marshals for the tournament will always check these weapons to make sure that they're safe. That includes checking the edges to make sure that there's no sharp nicks and gaiters along the edge. So you'll see on this one, the viewers might not, but there's quite a few nicks from where it's been hit. We have to make sure that those are smooth so it's not catching when I'm running my finger along it. They'll be checking the thickness of the edge. They're also checking that the actual points or the edges are rebated to a certain diameter, dependent on the rule set, so it's not too pointy. Because things do happen, blades will go wayward, and obviously we want to minimise what they're going to be able to do. And then obviously they're weighed, and then if they meet the parameters for use, they'll get a sticker such as the blue one or a checked sticker to say that's fine, and the marshals will check that when you go into the list as well.
All right, so you've armoured up, you've got all your protective clothing on, you're about to join the battle, you have to go to the marshal and they weigh everything. And
so before any fight even happens, you go into the list with your team, so you'll be called to the list by the secretary for the event. You'll go into the list, the marshals will come over and check, one, is your helmet done up properly? Because we're going to be grappling, people will be pulling on these. So they've got straps, obviously, to retain them. So they'll check that your straps are done up. They'll check that, obviously, you've got the stickers applicable for that event on your weapon. You shouldn't be using any weapon that's not been checked. Not that we don't trust people, but at the end of the day, we check them for a reason. So if it's got a sticker on it and it's passed the weapons check, then it's been deemed safe to use. So they'll check that. They'll also check the general condition of your armour. So they'll give you a quick look over to make sure you've not got any pieces that are loose, straps that are undone, or anything that's wayward. So obviously the last thing you want to do is get into the fight and all of a sudden a piece of your armour's hanging off and you get hit where you don't want. And they'll also check for critical items as well. So things that are mandatory for safety. So sabatons, foot protection, are mandatory. In HMB, that is. Not necessarily in IMCF, but if you've got somebody who's my size in armour, 125 kilos, that falls on your foot, you'd be grateful of a sabaton. Back of neck protection as well. So checking under the aventail to make sure that we have the cervical spine protection protecting the neck, so that if that was to lift and a wayward axe or sword went in, you still had some steel between your neck and the blade that might come in.
If you've got all the armour on, does that mean you can be hit anywhere?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it depends on what style of armour that you've got. So if we talk specifically about myself, I wear articulating arms, which in effect are plate steel arms, 1mm hardened. The rebrace and the van brace, this element and the elbow are all attached. So they're all riveted together and they articulate. And then I wear my shoulders, my pauldrons that come down, effectively creating a full piece of steel that covers me from shoulder to wrist. Gauntlets, hardened steel gauntlets. So obviously protecting the hands is vital. You can get hit in the hands. People will hit you in the hands. So obviously protecting these.
Because the hands are a legitimate target.
Legitimate target. Obviously, if you disarm somebody by hitting them hard enough in the hand or the wrist, they've lost their weapon. All of a sudden, it'll change the dynamic of a fight. So yeah, hardened steel. I wear a brigandine, so effectively like a jacket with plates, a vest with plates, if you will. Earlier coat of plates evolved into brigandines before we got then into cuirasses and breastplates. So I wear a brigandine, and then I wear plate steel legs as well. So everything in that respect is to give me good coverage and good safety. On the head, this is one of my helmets. I brought this one along because it's very typical of what you would think a knight would wear with respect to the cross on the front. This is a Romance of Alexander type helmet. So this has a front face plate with a pin on it, so the visor does lift up. So in between fights, the visor can be up. You can breathe freely. It comes down, clicks into place. Obviously gives me full protection during. And this is hardened steel also. Now, on the head, we have a minimum thickness of 2.5mm. And that's purely to obviously deal with the fact that we're going to be getting hit with potential pole arms up to that 3.5 kilo mark. This one in particular, or maces, or axes, or the falchions. This one in particular is 3mm on the dome, as we call it, so effectively roughly to where that visor line is, and then 2.5 mil, down the sides. So I've got a little bit of extra thickness up here, and then a little bit less here just to save some weight.
I imagine you don't get anyone with a great helm or something like that.
Some people have used them in the past. It needs to be historically, like we say, in line with the period of the kit. At the moment, it seems to be prevalent that people are using what we call a wolf rib, which is in effect the same bassinet shape, but instead of having a full visor on, it has a central bar down the middle and 5 bars that come off to the side. So it's open in that respect, in that it gives you brilliant visibility. So you've got roughly this amount of vision from where my hands are without turning my head, and a small turn you can see more. Each helmet has its pros and cons, but they've got to be built to a minimum specification.
I do like the salets, but you don't see them on.
No, there are very few that we see in this sport specifically because it's making the adaptations to them. One, to keep the historical look, if you will, but making them sport safe. I think there was a guy in America that got one made in effect where he had the salet to a point and then it had a welded metal cage underneath that was covered by chainmail, which was done by one of the smiths, I think, in the Ukraine. And that was a very good attempt, you know, in terms of kind of bridging the safety aspect of the sport with trying to keep it historical.
Because they wear a neck piece, don't they, that covers the jaw and that. Is that not legal then?
You can wear a bever. So with a salet, you would typically have some kind of bever that comes underneath. That's absolutely fine. That's not a problem. You could wear that. But it's actually getting the helmet in a position where it's going to give you enough protection from that concussive force. So on the inside of this helmet, it's got a very thick, what we call a parachute liner. So in essence, it is a padded liner, quilted and sewn. And inside, it's got foam that comes up into points. That's laced at the top, so you can adjust that, and it gives you a good amount of space and cushioning between the sides and the top. So it gives you some impact resistance and absorption. In a salet, I don't know how that would be achieved. I'm not an armourer, so I wouldn't be able to, you know, comment knowledgeably, but I think it could be done. But it'd have to be done, obviously, like we said, to be in keeping with the sport safety side of things as well as the historical side of things.
Okay, so sports safety, what injuries can you get?
Most of the injuries are relatively subdued. Soft tissue injuries, cuts, bruises typically. We have had some broken bones, you know, fractured arms, fractured collarbone, fingers. If you're not wearing sufficient hand protection and you get hit hard enough, you know, thumbs, fingers, they do happen. Ligament injuries, you know, if a leg gets fast as you're getting thrown to the ground, you can tear ligaments and things like that. At the end of the day, it's a combat sport. So the injuries that you would see in any other combat sport, such as MMA, things like that, you know, you would see those kind of injuries. You see cuts, you see people getting their arms broken, you see ACL tears. It's exactly the same in that respect from an injury perspective, albeit not as often. Not as often. The armour does exactly what it's intended to do in the sense that you don't get killed. You might get hurt a little bit. You'll feel a hit through it, but you won't get, like we said, you won't get mortally wounded. Given that we've taken thrusts out of the sport, that obviously negates a lot of injuries because thrusts would find gaps, would find vulnerable areas like your armpits, like your groin, you know, the inside of the elbow where wood blades. But, you know, I think over the last 3 or 4 tournaments that we've had 2 fractures. We had a collarbone and we had an arm, a fractured forearm at the one before, both from halberds, both from axes, big pole weapons. One that came down where he didn't see it and it's hit him in the collarbone. And that was through the chainmail, through the padding, through his armour. The shock was enough to fracture the collarbone. And then the one prior to that was somebody putting their arm up to block an axe that was coming in because he was using an axe. He didn't have a shield. So he's put his arm up and it's caught him just right. He was wearing splint arms, which were basically long strips of overlaid steel on leather, I think. And it's just caught him just in the right place to fracture his forearm.
Typical.
Yeah.
Sod's law.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of the overall, if you think the amount of tournaments that have happened and happen over a year, obviously COVID put a dent in it the last few years, but if you look at typically the amount of tournaments that happen, those are typically the biggest extent of the injuries. Fractures do happen, ligaments do get hurt. Some people do end up with cuts and bruises, but my favourite saying is you don't go swimming and not get wet. You don't go into a list with 10 other people, 24 other people, 60 other people, armed up, with armour, with weapons, and not expect to get hit and not expect to take some impact at times.
The first one you mentioned, it was actually a recent tournament you did, and so I think I've got some video of that. It was quite, you could feel it as that came down on him.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I'll name him. Unfortunately, Dan, who's 5'9".
Shout out to Dan there.
Dan.
I'm going to come back. Thumbs up. Thank you. That one.
Unfortunately, Dan was in the 12v12s. He was in the middle and he's looked to see something breaking down on one side. And at that moment, Big Ben, who's 6'6", who's a very big bloke with a very big axe, cut across him. He didn't see it coming, and it's hit him in the right place.
Do we like Ben?
Oh yeah, Ben's a lovely chap. Ben hits you and then apologises for hitting you.
All right, gentleman.
Yeah, Ben's great. Like we say, it's the spirit of the sport. You're going to get hit. These things are going to, it's going to happen. Someone's going to take that opportunity where you're not paying attention or you're not looking because what's going on there? And you get blindsided.
So is that most of the injuries? Because there's multiple opponents rather than just a one-on-one duel. Yeah. So, and then you can get 2 or 3 people on one?
Yeah, so in the group fights, you can be in a grapple with somebody and their teammate can come over and start hitting you from behind. You can get to a point where you're stuck in a sense where 2 people have got hold of you and one person can pick where they want to hit you. In the dueling and the pro fights, it is 1v1. You've only got one person to worry about. You've not got your back to have to worry about or watch or not necessarily hope that your teammates haven't gone down and then there's a man advantage to come and attack you. But yeah, typically in those scenarios, that's where you're going to get hit by more than one person, potentially in the chaos, in the fray, if you will.
In the melee.
Yeah.
So is this just in an open field? Where is this?
Well, tournaments are ran all over the place. I mean, when we run our tournaments, we do it in a relatively sizable field. We build the list, which for us is a 15 by 10 metre structure. And that's big enough to do the 5v5s and the 12v12s.
A list,
yeah. So that's the historical term for it. So when we think jousting, you'll probably be familiar with the tilt, which is down the middle. A list was effectively a barriered arena.
It's like a boxing ring.
Yeah, in essence. There's different accounts and different drawings and pictures through time of them being octagonal, being round, being rectangular. But the list is the term that we use for the arena in which we fight, so where the action takes place. So yeah, typically the tournaments are held in a field, in suitable space, with a list. The action happens in the list. The preparation happens outside of the list.
So ladies are involved as well?
Yeah. So
they fight against men? Or?
No. So you've got male categories and female categories. Don't get me wrong, the ladies will train with the men. And we have, a few ladies that train with us at our club regularly. And we have ladies from other clubs that will come and train with us. But we've also got to ensure that it's a relatively level playing field with respect to characteristics. So you've got female fights and you've got male fights. So the female categories are all the same as the males. So you've got dueling, you've got pro fights, you've got the 3v3s, the 5v5s, etc. And they will fight just as viciously as we will.
But you mentioned before about different participants having a different role. You could imagine a female being light of foot moving about or vice versa?
Yeah, you can. The biggest problem is, from my perspective, and I'm not speaking on behalf of anybody else here, with regards to sometimes the strength disadvantage, like I mentioned Ben before, Ben is 6'6", probably 120, 130 kilos out of armour. He's a big boy. He does damage. He hits hard. That can be, or could be, a potential problem. That's not to say that some of the ladies would not hold their own against a lot of the men. Trust me, they would. But
there's just no need to put them in harm's way then? Or
not necessarily. I wouldn't use harm's way, but I wouldn't necessarily want to see that happen. That's me personally. Facilitating the ladies, their fights, building their team, building their leagues is a priority. I mean, I've got a daughter. If she wants to be in this sport as she grows up, that's where I want her to be. I want her to be at the forefront in a well-established team, well-established leagues, and that's only going to happen through more females getting into the sport, but feeling safe enough to do so. That's probably a big point. It's probably very daunting, and I can't speak on behalf of anybody, but I can imagine it's very daunting for a female that wants to get into what was a very male-dominated sport and train safely and succeed. We're in a very privileged position now where we've got teams like Swords of Cygnus, which was set up specifically as a women's-only team, a women's-only training environment, which has grown massively. We've got, Armoured Combat Gloucester and their Hellions ladies that have grown massively, where they have their ladies-only nights for training. And now, like we said, the Infernal Unicorns in Glasgow. We've got a lot of female teams developing a culture and a space where women feel comfortable to get into the sport, try the sport, And I think that that's probably one of the biggest things as to why having a female side and a male side is a good thing, rather than saying, well, equal opportunities, let the ladies fight the men. If they want to, that's absolutely fine. However, the rules don't facilitate that. The categories are female and male. And I think for the development of the sport and for the better of the sport, the way that it's gone, that's ideal. That's what we need. We need those, where females getting into the sport feel safe and comfortable to do so in an environment with other females that have had like-minded experiences and can benefit from that in their training and the way that they're going to approach the sport. So
at your club, you have both male and females, and they train together.
Yeah.
It's just they can't compete together.
Yeah, so we train together. We'll do the conditioning together. We'll do the wrestling. We'll do the soft kit. But we've got to be conscious of everybody's abilities, everybody's capabilities, and the levels of intensity at which we train. And that's one thing that I'm very, very receptive to, because I know that some of the female fighters that are still in this sport to this day, that have grown the sport for the females, have had some bad experiences in the past with respect to training with male fighters. And that's something that we've got to be conscious of. I want to help develop the female side of the sport and facilitate as much as possible, even if that's allowing the gym, the club, to be used for the ladies-only trainings, which is something that we do.
Just one final bit about safety. Injuries and that, is there a high turnover of people because of injuries? Do people retire?
Yeah, I mean, some people do. What we tend to find more so is...
What I'm thinking of is people are interested and they want to come to sport, will the possibility of being injured put them off, or is it still...
Yeah, I mean, it's a conscious acknowledgement that you're doing a sport that you could get hurt in. That's the reality of it. You step into a boxing gym, you're going to get punched in the face. You step into an MMA gym, somebody might pick you up and drop you on your head in wrestling.
And you've not got protective clothing.
Yeah, that's going to happen. So there's an acknowledgement and an assumption of risk there that in the sport, that's going to happen. You might get hurt, you might get hit, you might end up bruised, you might end up with an injury like that. What we try to do, especially with the training, we don't just chuck people straight in. We don't just go, here's some armour, let's beat you up. That doesn't happen. We bring people into the gym.
But it's that excites people when they come.
It is that excites people, but what we try to make people understand from day one is to get to this point, i.e. to be safe in the armour, you have to be at least trained to an extent to understand what to expect. Carrying 35 kilos of armour around of itself when you're wearing it is a challenge, physically, mentally as well. We have to build people up to that. So we have to do conditioning. There's no point throwing somebody into the list in a 3v3 situation if they don't know how to safely defend themselves against somebody that's trying to grapple and hit them, or how to actually grapple and hit someone. So the training is very akin to that of any other martial art. You're not going to go into a boxing gym day one and get chucked in the ring sparring against that seasoned professional. You're going to get taught the basics from the ground up to a point where the instructors, the veterans, if you will, feel that you're safe. Then they'll graduate you into something that's, suitable for your level, and then build you up. And that's what we aim to do as well.
Tell us about what people would expect if they came and trained with you on day one.
Yeah, so when anybody new comes to the club, effectively we ask you to come down and basically watch and kind of sit in on a session. The sessions will differ and they do deviate dependent on what we're doing, depending on where we are in the year, if we've got a tournament that we're aiming for. So if we've got, for example, individuals that are aiming to pro fight, which is the one-on-one discipline, our training may well be aimed more towards techniques and the viability of training for that discipline as opposed to just the sport as a whole. We get people to come in, have a look, see how we train, the conditioning side, the technique side. And then if they're still interested, we graduate them in slowly. So we have a set of basic kind of syllabus, if you will, specifically to us as a club, how I teach, and every club's different, of how we teach people the basics from footwork, stance, movement, striking and defending with a sword and a shield, for example, and then grappling and wrestling. We treat them all as individual components, and then we try to bring them together as people's training progresses. And that's how we teach them to be safe.
So they've got to have a certain level of strength and stamina?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, they don't have to walk into the gym and be the prime example of what we're looking for in a fighter, because nobody is. What we're looking for is somebody that's willing to come in and, one, enthusiastic to want to just do the sport, whether that's for their own fitness goals or whether it's just a duel or whether it's, I want to get in there and do the 5v5s. doesn't matter to us. That's exactly what we want. Somebody that comes in with the enthusiasm to want to participate, but somebody that's also willing to use their ears, listen, be coachable. There's a lot of failed experience of people making mistakes, myself included, where things have gone wrong. I've done things that I should have done differently, and I've tried to develop the way that I would try and help people along their own journey. Ultimately, everybody's different. So what we try to do is give them a basic framework and let them find what they're comfortable with, and then develop that. When they found that spark on something, they might happily use a sword and shield, and that might be exactly what they want. So we try and develop their technique around that. They might want to use a two-handed axe, and they might have a particular proclivity for being able to swing one efficiently. We try and then develop that and how they can use it efficiently, not only at hitting people, but when they're being grappled. And, we try to develop the individuals whilst developing everybody in the club at the same time.
What's the age range?
So for the armoured combat specifically, it's 18 and above. There is specifically soft medieval combat, HMB soft, there's many different terms for it, which is aimed at children from around about 6 years up to 17 years. That's specifically the basics. So that's using soft shields, it's using soft swords, very similar to the soft trainers that you can get from the Night Shop or the HEMA shop. You'll see Buhurt mentioned on the front page of our website, the Buhurt soft trainer swords. Though that type of equipment to help develop children on basics and technique so they can get involved. Children can get involved in the sport safely, but the actual armoured combat is 18 and above.
You don't train at all without any protection? Right. So apart from obviously doing strength training or whatever.
So the strength and conditioning where we're typically doing, like we say, if we're doing barbell work or if we're doing high intensity interval training circuits, that kind of condition is obviously done without any protection on, because it's just like going to your normal gym. When we get into the wrestling side of things, there's no protection that we will wear, but we go slowly through techniques, step by step. We try to break them down into a number of kind of logical steps in a sequence, from A to B to C to D. We run those through slowly and we build up to speed, and that's where we build the safety aspect in. When we get into the sparring with the swords and the shields, obviously if we're in armour, we've got the armour on. We've already talked about the sport, kind of safety side of that. When we're talking about soft kit sparring, that's something that we use the HMB soft swords and shields for, where we do wear padding. So we will wear, leg padding, we'll wear padded arms and jackets, we'll wear gloves, hockey gloves, lacrosse gloves, HEMA gloves. We've got a plethora of Red Dragon gloves at the club that we use to protect your hands.
Have you got the plumber's pipe in the end of the...
Just to strengthen the fingers,
yeah. Oh, nightmare, yeah. The number of times I've hurt my thumbs.
Yeah.
But now I use Spez heavies. I don't know if you know them.
Spez heavies, yeah. So we do use that kind of padded helmets as well, to protect us when we're doing sparring. A lot of what we tend to try to do, we have specific days where we go full armour, where we're focused on 5v5s, 3v3s, dueling pro fights, to build that technical proficiency. Week in, week out, in our sessions, Tuesdays and Thursdays, we're looking at conditioning, we're looking at skill building, technical sparring. So where we're not going 100 miles an hour, there's no ego chasing in the gym where someone's hitting hard and then someone hits harder. We're building on that to try and find a gap, have good defence, work on this specifically. We're coaching through trying to build to the point where we then get in the armour and we then apply it.
So on a Tuesday and a Thursday, I come down. I don't know if you do any other days as well. What will I do?
Yeah, so typically...
And what times is it?
Yeah, so we train on a Tuesday and a Thursday, 7 till 9. We do train at the weekends, but we have to schedule those sessions around the season, around other tournaments, around other club trainings. As I said before, we will go to other clubs, we will go to national trainings to get that experience, broaden the horizon. But on a Tuesday and a Thursday, 7 till 9, we typically start with, obviously, a mobility and a warm-up, and then we'll do some element of conditioning. Now, if it's a day where we've scheduled grappling or wrestling, that will form the basis of the conditioning, because it is one of the toughest elements, if you will, because it taxes your whole body. If it's a day where we're looking more on technical striking, pel work, sword and shield, or dueling, then we'll do some kind of conditioning, whether that's a high-intensity circuit, 6, 7, 8 stations, depending on the numbers. Burpees are a big favourite in the club. I know everybody's rolling their eyes when I say that. But, burpees, bodyweight exercises, we typically get the conditioning done in the first half. on those days, and then we go into the technical sparring or the technical teaching thereafter.
So you get used to being able to throw your own body about before you start putting things on and make yourself even heavier.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, the armour is a very, very heavy weight. Depending on how you customise your kit and what material you use, my full steel kit for Buhurt is around about 37 kilos, all in. It's probably a little bit heavy for what most people would, but that's there or thereabouts.
So would you train with a weighted vest?
You can do, but it can be unnecessary stress on your joints, and it doesn't necessarily sit the way your armour would. So what we tend to do is we build people's conditioning, so we build the fitness up, because the minute you put the armour on, you've got the extra weight bearing on your body, then moving around in it is an exercise in and of itself. So we build that element of conditioning up with the fitness, and then off the back of that, we do strength and endurance training. The grappling side of things is completely different. As soon as we get into the wrestling, that is just a whole body energy taxing exercise.
I imagine it gets really hot as well.
Yeah, it does. Very hot, very sweaty. We have a fun exercise for the benefit of the grappling and conditioning that we refer to as a shark tank, which in effect is the person in the middle wrestles everybody else that's in the session without a break. So if you've got 10 people there and you're doing 45 seconds rounds, you wrestle 9 other people without a rest.
And then he takes, because we take our gambesons off then and give it to the next bloke.
Yeah.
You'd ring it out.
Yeah, so that we do that obviously outside of the kit in your own sports clothes where you're comfortable. But that is really grinding. It's grueling. You get a different look off everybody. Everybody else is fresh, so typically they'll push your pace harder. You've got to manage your energy. You've got to be able to kind of fight when you're tired. And I think the big one is not mentally check out. Because if you mentally check out in that scenario, i.e. your mind, I'm done, I've had enough, I'm tired. If you don't have that when you're in a fight and you're in the midst of it, it can be really, really challenging in the sport, especially in the middle of all the chaos. So we do those kind of shark tank exercises really to drill down into the conditioning and help build it. You'd be surprised the barriers that people push through though when they're in that atmosphere where you've got, you've wrestled 5 people and come on, keep it going, come on. You've got that encouragement still. You've still got your teammates are the ones wrestling you, making you tired, but you've still got the encouragement to break those barriers down. And then afterwards, you can kind of go, see, you've just done 4.5 minutes or you've just done 5 minutes without a break.
Well, you're still standing.
Yeah, you still stood there. You're not dead. You've got through it. You're tired. You might feel more tired than you've ever been before. You've never been as taxed. You'll be sore for a week afterwards, but you get through it and you break that barrier. And then next time, it's not as bad. And then we build it up and we can switch it up.
So how long does a lesson last?
2 hours. So we train, like we said, from 7 till 9. Dependent on, like I've said before, what we're doing or what we're gearing up for could dictate whether we're looking at specific techniques or things that we need to work on. Wrestling techniques or striking techniques, working in a 2v1 situation and the communication that you need to have to work with your teammate. That'll be dependent on, like I said, what we're doing, what tournaments we've got coming up.
So you mentioned tournaments. Is it like a full calendar of events throughout the year? Yeah.
So domestically, it's bigger now than it ever has been. So we've got an event in 2 weeks, 25th of June in Silloth in Cumbria, called Ragnarok. So we've got that one. There's one in July, Fantasy Forest, which is ladies only. So the Fantasy Forest Festival, Swords of Cygnus put that event on and the ladies go out and they do their thing, which is really good. Then at the end of July, you've got the Mercia Challenge, which is being held by a team called White Company. And that's going to be very, very well attended, both domestically and internationally. There's a team from America flying over. The current best team in America are coming over for that one. There's a guy, I think, flying in from Australia or New Zealand coming over to get involved in that one. So we do have a schedule of events. These are typically done by the governing body. And then also on top of that, you've got the international tournaments as well. So when the French Federation put tournaments out there, we're eligible to go to those if we can schedule them and we want to go. A UK team can happily go across the channel, go and fight in France or go to Iron Challenge in Denmark or Tony di Alpi in Italy. There's a big, wide calendar.
Okay, so you mentioned about the competitions. Do you get awards? Is there and sponsors? Do they give awards? What happens there?
Yeah, so most tournaments are obviously organised and put on by clubs or by individuals. everything costs something, and we're very lucky in this sport that there are a lot of companies and armourers that are willing to help with prizes. So we typically have winners' trophies, of course, medals for first, second, and third place in the disciplines.
Medals and badges always help.
Yeah, but we also then do get the benefit of some sponsors. So Quiverstock, which is a UK-based retailer, they're based up in Scotland, that do everything for reenactment as well as Buhurt. So they do padding, for example, tailor-made. They do clothing. They do archery, longbows, etc. They have been a big sponsor of ours recently and a big proponent in helping us give prizes to people. Some of the other ones like Buhurt Tech, which are a Ukrainian-based armoury, if you will, Medieval Extreme, same again. Patterson Shieldcraft, who are one of our sponsors, who's also a fighter. He makes really, really good shields. They've all been pivotal in helping us kind of reward people for their efforts. Typically in tournaments, we also get most valuable fighters, and we also get the Will to Win award. So both in male and female, the judges, the marshals, the committee, if you will get together at the end after the fighting's done and pick out the most valuable fighters. So the people from teams, the individuals on male and female that made the most difference, maybe got the most takedowns, maybe facilitated the best movement or better tactics or spurred the team on, they would get picked and obviously get an award for that. And then you have the Will to Win, which is exactly what it says on the tin. You might not have won every round, but you were willing to fight until you were beaten. And then again, the marshals and the committee had picked that, confer on it, and then obviously they get announced at the end. So, there are prizes to be won. But at the end of the day, the tournaments are there for the sake of competition in the sport. But without the sponsors, without the organisers, without the marshals to referee, without the event secretaries to call people on time and mark scores, these things wouldn't happen. So the support side of the sport is just as big to facilitate us lumping these on and knocking lumps out of one another.
Okay, Daniel, so who would you like to invite to your club? Who can come?
The club's open to anybody. We're inclusive. You're able to come down, you're able to get involved in the sport in any capacity that you choose. You don't have to come down with the aim to fight. If you want to come down and you want to be a marshal, you're interested in getting involved with the historical, the authenticity side of the sport, or if you want to be a fighter and you want to train to fight, you're all welcome. Like we've said before, armoured combat is for 18 plus, so people getting into armour and physically getting having a go, see how it feels and build into that is 18 plus. The HMB soft side for children is more structured. Obviously, we have to kind of lump that together to make sure that we've got the right safeguarding in place.
So if I just wanted to just come down and enjoy a good workout, I can do that as well?
Yeah.
And then just back you all when you all go off to the tournaments?
It's an alternative way of fitness. You'll get fit swinging axes at Pels and swinging swords rather than throwing a battle rope around in a commercial gym. Although we do have battle ropes and we will use them.
So would you invite the HEMA community down to train with you?
Absolutely. I mean, we've got a few HEMA practitioners that have graduated over to the sport. The fencing skills are transferable, very much so, to what we do.
That surprises me because I didn't think they would be.
Yeah, with a few tweaks, like we said, to suit the rule set. But if you've got somebody that's been, dealing with sword and buckler or buckler and rapier to an extent, or sabre, or like we said before, Dusac, if they have those basic skills, they've got the footwork, it's very minor changes for them to get used to sword and shield, or to get used to the sword and buckler within our rule set. And then from there, the thing that they may not be familiar with, if they've not done harness fetching or they've not done the ringing, they've not done the wrestling side, that might be a little bit different where they have to learn. But like we say, if somebody's open-minded and willing to learn, anybody's welcome.
So the footwork works. It's not standing there thrashing again if you've got the proper technique.
Yeah. If you haven't got the proper technique and you get wrong-footed, especially in armour, you'll go over very easily. Like I said, this will change your body mechanics and the dynamics of how you do things somewhat. But good basics and good foundation transfer through.
You're training, like you said, to be attack and to defend. Is that in the treatises or is that just something within the sport?
Yeah, so I mean, there are treatises where, when you look at it from all the masters, especially with respect to wrestling, with grappling, where you will have to deal with an opponent that's attacking you, as well as take the initiative and attack an opponent. Specifically for what we do, because it's more of a modern sport, we have to adapt some of the techniques that we see in more modern combat sports judo being a good one for the grappling side of things, and change it ever so slightly to try and find out how it works in the armour. So when you've got a shield strapped to your arm, you've got a sword in your hand, you don't have the dexterity in your hands to grip like you would if you were doing judo in a gi. We have to try and apply those techniques a little bit differently to get the same end result as putting somebody on the floor.
So you're more like sumo then?
Sumo,
where you're just grippling around.
Sumo is a brilliant example in the respect that their rule set, anything other than your feet touching the dojo or getting pushed out, you're out. If you get pushed out of the list, you're out. Anything other than the feet touch the floor, you're out. So those techniques are great in that respect, but they're so different when you translate them into armour. When you put on the equipment, because all of a sudden you've got restrictions in mobility that you didn't have previously when you don't have it on. You've got extra things that you've got to be concerned about. You've got a weapon in your hand. You've got a shield on your arm, which makes it more cumbersome to maybe get an underhook or even get an overhook on someone's arm to control that person. All the while they're trying to do the same thing to you.
You mentioned shields. What type of shields do you use?
There's different types.
Full kite shields or?
Yeah, I mean, in the big 150s, there were Pavis type shields, purely because of obviously the number of ranks. And I think the Dutch team did try and employ some Pavis shields, which didn't really work out very well. Typically, they're heater shields for the dueling. So 75 by 65, I think, size-wise. Standard traditional heater shields. For the group fights, you'll see most people using small Pavis type shields strapped to their arm, both defensively to protect themselves, but offensively to punch people. You can use it as a weapon, you've got an edge on it. Or bucklers. People will use bucklers. I have a preference to use a buckler with my falchion because I find, for me personally, it's easier to grapple with. So it's easier for me to get it into places under people's arms if I'm trying to gain a position or control something than with a punch shield. But that's just my preference.
I like bucklers. I do rapier and buckler or rapier and dagger, and it's excellent. So can I be a little bit derogatory now then? As I said, I practice HEMA. It's a wonderful sport. It's very technical. Yeah. I'm not just clubbing people. Are you just clubbing people?
No. Believe it or not, no, we're not. I mean, it might look that way, but it is very, very methodical. In the way that we teach people, we teach people very, very similar, especially with falchions, where we're slashing and we're cutting, dusak, sabre, without the thrusts. So the cuts are very similar. The guards are very similar, especially when you then graduate into the dueling side of things, where it is one-on-one. A lot of what we do is similar in that respect. In the chaos, when it is 5v5 and it is 12v12, and you throw in the element of grappling as well, where we're not just on about striking one another, you've got somebody that wants to wrestle you. That changes the dynamic of how you can be effective. I think film and TV has probably given us a big misconception of how battles could be. I have no doubt in my mind that even the most chivalric knight, who was very well trained in what he did, would have slashed, bludgeoned, done whatever was necessary within the fight at close quarters to win.
As soon as you're tired as well, and you're sweating, and there's body, you're injured. And...
Yeah. I can't imagine that there were a line of English knights and a line of French knights that just all chose to half-sword each other one-on-one. It's not going to happen. You're going to have horses riding into people to break lines, running over people.
And I imagine then they would have been in little groups, wouldn't you? You would have had your best mates with you.
Potentially, yeah, fighting shoulder to shoulder, or a knight and his squires or his men at arms fighting as a company or maybe a rank. We know that in history the English tended to prefer fighting on foot, so that would have been with primary weapons such as lances and spears, poleaxes, war hammers, those concussive weapons. The arming swords and the daggers would have been the secondary weapons.
Because that's the problem with films, isn't it? It doesn't show spears, and spears would have been the major weapon throughout history.
Yeah, they would have been, yeah.
So if you're using a falchion and it gets knocked out of your hand, have you got a secondary weapon?
You can, yeah. I mean, I wear a belt with a frog on it. So in effect, I can carry a mace in that belt, or I can carry a single-handed axe in that belt. If I get disarmed, then obviously I've got the ability to get it and carry on fighting. If you don't carry a secondary weapon within our rule set, you have to run back to get one from your side of the list.
Being chased by 5 others.
Being chased by somebody, yeah. So the minute you're disarmed, in effect, you're not allowed to offensively carry on fighting someone.
So you can't just grapple or punch? Or...
You can defend yourself. So I could grab, if you had a one-handed axe, I could grab the haft of the axe. I can keep hold of it. That's defensive. If I punched you in the face, that's against the rules when I've not got a weapon. So I would have to break away to get one. So you either don't drop it or most people will carry one or run back to try and get one.
So you've not got it tied to you in any way?
You can use straps or you can use leather thonging. This mace doesn't have it, but people will drill them, put a bit of leather cord through or thonging, just put it over the wrist. So if it comes out, it's hung on the wrist and then they've just got to retrieve it. Same with axes. I have a leather strap. It's not on this falchion at the moment, but I do have a leather strap that just sits over the outside of my gauntlet so that if it comes loose in my hand, it just spins. So it's still there and I can try and retrieve it. That's my first protocol of not losing that weapon.
You mentioned before about technique, because I was jokingly derogative about it. Whilst you were talking, all the techniques I can think of, you parry and then you thrust. So what would your technique, if you parried, then what?
Well, it depends again.
You hit it with the back of the blade?
It depends on the discipline. So if we're talking the group fights specifically, a lot of the parrying that you will see is done with the shield. The shield's there for defense. So if somebody's trying to hit me, the shield is there to obviously protect me as much as possible. When I'm specifically wielding a falchion, what I'm trying to do is hit people where they're going to feel it. Now, we know that swords weren't necessarily concussive against armour.
You're going to give out your favourite area where you like to hit now.
The thigh is a prime area that I like to hit. Anywhere that's potentially vulnerable. So hitting soft bits is inevitable. So, the inside of the bicep, for example, isn't well covered, but it is a legal target zone. The back of the thigh.
Difficult to get to, though.
Difficult to get to, but if somebody's pinned or they've got their arm over the list, that's potentially available. The back of the thigh. Most people have creases that do wrap round somewhat, but the back of the thigh is a legal target. The bum is a legal target within the rule set. So we're targeting shots to try and, at the end of the day, within the group fights, we're trying to put people down through two means, really. They're either going to succumb to the blows that they're being hit with, or they're being thrown to the floor through the grappling techniques.
If they don't go down, can they surrender? Can they say...
Yeah, if someone puts a hand up or takes a knee, if they go down to one knee, like if somebody shows the palm of their hand in the middle of a fight, as in a whoa, that would be taken as a submission. If they take a knee, that's what would normally happen. Someone will just literally go to the floor and make that third point of contact. They're out of the fight as well.
I'm about at this point, though, going to show the viewers a video I've got of yourself where you're on your knee and you're constantly being hit and someone says, get up. So you took the knee there. But...
So in that particular, we were doing pro fights. So within pro fights, the rule set's slightly different in that 1v1, standing striking, scored for points. So blows, if it's a good hit, a normal hit, it's 1 point. If it's an accented hit that off-balances you, for example, it's 2 points. If I throw you or get a takedown, they're scored. And within the rule set, I get 10 seconds then from a position of dominance to work on you. On the floor, because it's a position of dominance, you get double points in effect. So it's 2 points for every strike. So in the video that you'll show where I'm on the floor getting punched in the face, I'm in a bad position. But if you let the video play a little bit longer, I get the throw and then I'm doing the same. So
I've not got that one. No, the one I've got is you're in full armour and the chap's just pounding in, he's shouting, you get up, get up.
Oh, I remember that. That was when you filmed the session for us, wasn't it, a few years ago? So that was pro fight training.
Right.
So at that particular round, myself and Winston were training for a pro fight competition that was in February. So that was in the January, I think, a few weeks prior. So that's the same thing. I went down. I'd actually injured my knee at that point. I'd ligament injury from a few months prior. So I felt my knee go. I went to one knee and he was hitting me, shouting, get up. In a pro fight, he would have been all over me. He would have knocked me to my back and he would have stood over me for 10 seconds, hitting me as much as he possibly could until we got told to stand up and carry on again.
So who's making the point or who's calculating the point?
So similarly, as we talked about line marshals, you have line counters. Line marshals. So you'd have one on each corner. Typically, you have two counting for each fighter. So they'll count the points through the round, and then there's a bit of confer, if you will, after that round. So if I get 16 and you get 14, then obviously it's a close. If I got 50 and you only got 10, there is a big issue with respect to what's being seen. But yeah, typically it's 2 counters, if you will, for each fighter. And then you've got obviously the marshal in the list.
Okay, well, this has been really informative, Daniel. I'm amazed. I was expecting it to be, I was going to pick on you. I was going to say HEMA's great and we both, but now I've got a better understanding. And my son trains with you, so you never know.
Yeah.
One day I'll come down and train with you.
Yeah, I mean, he's very good. I think one thing I will say, I've seen a lot online with respect to HEMA good, HMB bad, HMB grunts, HEMA's no good. There is division in the community, and I appreciate that people have their own opinions and thoughts on what they do versus what other people do. For me personally, there's a crossover. There's a way for the sports to exist as they are.
There's always going to be fanboys, particularly about one
of course there
thing
is.
or another.
The thing is, what we do is not to be taken out of context. It is a modern sport version of something that did happen historically, but we have to make it safe. We've got health and safety. We have to do certain things to make sure that it happens. There are people that are in this sport, specifically HMB, that do participate in HEMA. We've got people that participate in HEMA that participate in HMB. There's a room for both. So, from my perspective, if there's anybody in the community that wants to come down and see what we're all about, please feel free.
If anyone is interested in getting hold of you, how can they get hold of you?
The easiest way to get hold of us is through the website. So within the website, we've got our contact information, so phone number and email. And we've also got it on all of our social media. So it's on the Facebook page, it's on Instagram, and obviously we've got our YouTube channel as well. We are on TikTok more recently, putting a few short snippets up there.
TikTok, that's really modern.
Yeah. We've evolved a little bit. But yeah, our YouTube channel, we tend to post the majority of our armoured training. We do that, we video it, and obviously we watch it back. We put it out there for feedback. As you can see, there's plenty of videos from different types of rounds, from dueling rounds to obviously group fight rounds. And then we've also got some reference information as well. So on the website, under the training and information and videos, we've got not only our calendar and our timetable, but if you scroll down on that section, there are our basic written syllabus for the sword and shield striking and some grappling techniques. So you'll see there, basic syllabus that we've put together, or I've put together, I should say. There's some wrestling rules, ringen. So people from the HEMA side of things will be familiar with ringen, German style of wrestling. And then there's a couple of videos as well. So there's a few intro playlists that we've put up there. So like introductions to pole arm using a quarterstaff techniques, introduction to sword and shield, introduction to some of the wrestling, and some build videos as well, how to make a DIY boffer. Very LARP.
What's a boffer?
Basically a soft sword.
Oh, right.
Solid rod, foam padding with a covering on the outside that you can use to facilitate practice. And obviously an introduction to longsword. So these are on there for anybody that wants to have a look at what you might get taught as kind of the start, the intro when you come into the club, what we kind of go over. Then obviously we take that from there and then move on.
Is it an expensive sport?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, there's no
people
bones
always
about
say,
it.
no, it's not.
No, there's no bones about it. With respect to the armour, it can be a how long's a piece of string question. You can put a kit together, second-hand, from people that are selling within the community that are reputable, for less money than if you just went and placed one order with an armourer, custom-made to measure for you. The barrier to entry for HEMA is probably cheaper, and it will be cheaper in terms of, getting yourself a fencing mask and a good HEMA jacket.
Everything's £100 though. Everything's 3 figures plus.
Yeah, I mean, the helmet that sat on the table was £650. Custom-made to my measurements by an armourer in the Ukraine who then shipped it to me. And I have 2 of his helmets, so that probably speaks to the quality.
So what would it be for a full set of plate?
If you're going full set of plate, you're probably looking at anywhere from 5,000 upwards, depending on your armourer, depending on your style, depending on their order book, and how busy they are.
And I suppose it's got to be a proper armourer. It can't be some blacksmith, because it's got to be historically accurate.
It needs to be accurate, but it's also making sure that it's going to be made safely. So there are armourers and recommendations that we would give to people, not just myself, but people in the community on the Facebook forums and groups, of good experiences and recommendations. Like I said, the armourer that made this helmet has made another helmet of mine that I've been wearing for the last probably 18 months now. This is a more recent addition last year before everything happened within the Ukraine. And my team I think there's 5 of us in our team that have all got helmets from him because he makes good quality armour safely for what we do. Gauntlets, recommendations, who we would, armourers that we would send people to. We don't want people buying off eBay, off Etsy, off selling sites, and unfortunately getting something that's 1 millimetre mild and it looks okay, but it is nowhere near safe to take the impact that's going to be dished out.
Something's going to cave in and hurt you.
Yes.
So you mentioned Ukraine there. Is it big throughout the whole of Europe?
Yeah, I mean, all over the world, there's teams of far afield. New Zealand has a team, a national team, and local teams, Australia. You've got Mexico, Argentina, the US. Big shout out to the US because we've got good friends over there. So US, Canada, and like we say, in Europe, we've got the UK. France has a very, very big tournament scene and a very big club scene. Germany, Poland, Switzerland, Finland, Russia, China.
Russia and Ukraine. Should we skip that for now? I mean, we'll skip that one for now.
But in terms of global reach, the sport is practiced in a lot of countries all around the world. That culminates in obviously not only domestic tournaments like the scene we've got in the UK, but international. So UK teams or other teams will go throughout Europe and all over the world. And then you've got obviously national and world championships that get held typically every 2 years. And that's where the nations come together and their delegation of teams and fight obviously for like the Battle of the Nations is the famous one, or the IMCF World Championships. Those 2 organisations hold those championships. Battle
of the Nations, I've heard of that. Yeah. Anyone can Google that on YouTube, and lots will come.
You'll get some great highlights.
Go on. I actually said, is there anything you want to say about Ukraine or Russia? Have you got friends on both camps?
Yeah, obviously friends and fighters on both camps. Obviously, I don't want to get too political with respect to what we're going to say, but my thoughts go out to everybody in the Ukraine at the moment that's affected. Some of our sponsors that are on the website, a lot of our friends, a lot of armourers, a lot of fighters being affected by it. And, I think a lot of Russian fighters that are unjustly caught up in everything else as well. However, all my thoughts with the Ukraine.
Good. Okay, we'll move on from there then, yeah. Okay, Daniel, so we're coming close to the end now. If you had the opportunity to have someone interviewed on a podcast just like this, who would it be? Would you have someone in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd have to go with some of the prominent female fighters in the sport. If we're talking specifically about the sport, Joe from Swords of Cygnus or Era from ACG, Gloucester, the ladies that have competed at the top of the sport, but are also at the grassroots level really developing the sport. Because that'd be a fascinating insight into, a little bit of what we talked about earlier on with respect to the female side of the sport, the competition side, how training differs, how the view of the sport differs, whether the approach is the same. Obviously, I can't speak specifically for anyone's experiences, but there would be, their aspirations, their past experiences would be great people to get on a podcast.
Excellent. Well, if you give me their details afterwards, I'll try my best to get them on.
I'll have a chat with them and we'll hopefully facilitate something.
Well, that's great. Fantastic. Is there anything you want to say? Is there anyone you want to give a shout out to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, first and foremost, I'll shout out the regulars at our club. Training with us at Honour and Arms. Without those people training with us, the club wouldn't exist. We set the club up to facilitate regular training for the sport. And we've been lucky enough that we've got more and more members to come and train. So without them, the club wouldn't exist. So thank you very much. And to be honest, thank you to the wider community as well. I'm not going to specifically thank every individual at every club, but the clubs coming together, supporting the tournaments like our Castleton Cup or coming to Ragnarok, and all the people attached to those clubs that help support, prop up the teams on the day, help organise. They're all stars. That's what we need. It is ultimately not just about the violence. You get a small snapshot when you watch the videos, and it is violent and it is aggressive. It's the community behind that. And it's not just the wider community, but it's the community that you build within your own clubs. You build, it's probably sound really cliche, but it is somewhat of a family. You get to know everybody. You get to work and fight and train with everybody, intimately. And then you have to do that on a wider scale with other clubs, build relationships with other people. Because whilst I'm training with my people week in, week out, at the World Championships, I'll be fighting shoulder to shoulder with people from other clubs, providing that you make the cut, So, yeah, a big shout out to everybody in the community. And hopefully, everybody's enjoyed listening. And the HEMA community. I hope that you've garnered something from this. I hope I don't come across as some Neanderthal that just likes bashing people with steel.
Far from it, Daniel, far from it.
And like I said...
Even though you do like bashing people with steel.
I do like bashing people with steel. I do. I enjoy it. But then again, it's one of those things.
It's a good de-stressor, is it?
It's very much so, yeah. Surprisingly, in amongst all the chaos, your mind will never be quieter.
We've talked a lot about the history and about how the sport is currently run. How do you see the future of the sport?
The future's bright for the sport, especially in the UK. It's been in a transitional period, and it still is to some extent over the last 12 to 18 months. There was a lot of hard work done to establish the national governing body. And now the majority of clubs are under the national governing body, but not all. It also provides an outlook for newer clubs to kind of something to attain. Having the right people in the right places within that organisation to grow the sport is immense, really, from where it was a few years ago to where we are now. So the future domestically is bright. There's an uncertain time at the moment with respect to the international scene. Each country are doing their own thing still, as they were, but obviously with events that are currently going on in the world, that has affected internationally somewhat. But I don't doubt that'll, something will resolve, something might come off as an offshoot, or even the organisations as a whole on the international level will kind of show themselves up, and we'll get back to where we were and continue developing.
So do you ever see it as like a spectator sport? I mean, will it grow?
Massively. I think there's something, it sounds really silly, but there's something visceral about the sport in and of itself. You realise that there's that it is real with what we do in terms of the impact and the fights. It isn't that reenactment, shots aren't pulled. This is competitive and people are fighting. And people get kind of captured by that and do come to watch it. I mean, our tournament, for being in a relatively small town and village, was well attended. And we get people young and old. We get the kids that look at the shiny knights. Whoa. And then you get the older generation. My mother, who's 70, shouting from the sidelines for me to fill someone in no uncertain terms. It does.
Shout out to Daniel's mum there.
Yeah, shout out, mum. So yeah, it does. And I think it can get to that point. It will take time. It's a young sport. It's only been around since, the 2009, 2010s when it started developing. But the more commercial it becomes, the more viewer-friendly that it becomes with the aid of technology and social media, the more widespread, it gives people an alternative to watch.
Getting on to, we've talked about it being a spectator sport, films. It's nothing like Gladiator, is it? Or anything like that. No. And is there a particular favourite in a film that...
I'm hesitant to say, because no matter what I say, I'm going to get absolutely shredded by either the people that are looking at the films from a historical accuracy point, from an armour perspective and a weapons perspective, or I'm going to get absolutely slated for people saying it wasn't what it should be. But I like The Last Duel that's recently come out on Netflix.
With the half face?
Yes. Now, this is why I'm saying I have to take it as a film, but given the fact that to an extent it recounts a historical, documented duel in France sanctioned by a king, it has some historical elements to it. We can find the accounts and read what happened.
So this is a judicial duel?
Yes. Was it historically accurate with respect to armour and weaponry? Probably not, but then again, it's a film. It's designed to capture people's imagination as the general populace, not as the individuals that are very much into what we do. So, you know, The Last Duel is a film that I like because I watch it for what it is. I don't sit there nitpicking at every aspect. I just watch it for it being a film. The King on Netflix was another good one. So obviously that's the King leading up to Agincourt.
I remember the scene where the French knight or king is killed, where he's in the mud.
Yeah. Not necessarily accurate, where the Dauphin falls over on his face in the armour and he can't get up.
I did like the fact, though, that everyone came in with their daggers.
Yeah, but with respect to the kind of the charge from the trees, you know, historical accounts from Agincourt was the English did line their bowmen into the trees. They did put wooden pikes. They did loose all their arrows and then charge in to fight on foot. Again, some cinematography and some not historical aspects that went into that, but the battle scene with respect to the grittiness, how muddy it was, you know, the horse charge, the cavalry charge into people, the impact, the fighting shoulder to shoulder where you can't move, that chaos, I think was very well depicted.
And as an archer, I mean, I can imagine once you've used all your arrows, and the knights are on you, you would then pull out your arming sword or your dagger and you'd be in close with your mates.
Well, that's it. You'd be on it, and in that particular situation where, you know, a lot of the French knights, cavalry, etc., had really struggled with the conditions. It made it easier for them. So I like that film. I mean, we're talking historic. I like The Outlaw King.
Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I like Game of Thrones. You know, you've got to take it for what it is. You can't look at it from that's not historical when you're talking about a programme that has dragons. You know, you can't nitpick at, well, he wouldn't have worn that armour, because it isn't aimed to be historical. But yeah, Game of Thrones, you know, The Witcher, I like The Witcher as a series. The Last Kingdom as a series. I know someone's going to slate me for that because of, you know, it's Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. But again, the characters are based in history. Alfred the Great.
There's one that does come to mind, though. That's the armour in it is amazing. 300 Spartans.
Yeah.
Would you go out in a loincloth and a cloak?
No, but what's interesting about that is you can still find excellent examples from, you know, Corinthian helmets, the barbute style helmets in bronze with a shield. You know, again, it's history.
But there's a nice one in the HEMA community that everyone likes. It's a comedy one. It's called The Princess Bride. Yeah. Because the dueling scene where they names all the masters.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Oh, you've got, you know, The Last Duel, for example. Not the Last Duel, but there is a Last Duel, an older version. Troy, for example. If you look at Troy, the film with Brad Pitt and Mr. Banner, you know, they use spear and shield, which you don't necessarily see in cinematography. And I'm a big fan, and I'm going to sit here now. I watch Scholar Gladiatoria and Matt Easton. I'm a big fan of Tobias Capwell. You know, I watch a lot of that kind of content myself because I'm just a fan of history, combat, whether it's medieval, whether it's Viking, Dark Age, you know, I love it. And I'm not I don't want to be pigeonholed into this is my sport, this is what I do. But with respect to the content, like we say, films, I take them for what they are.
You've hinted at something there. How long are you going to stay in this? Where's your path going to take you?
I mean, for me, it's something that is part of my life. You know, I run a club. We train weekly. The good thing about this for me is I can see the long term is that even if I'm not competing, I can still be involved in marshalling. I can still be involved in the sport, being a contributing element to the betterment, whether that's to the betterment of the club, to the betterment of an individual, to the betterment of the tournament scene. You know, so for me, when my competitive days do come to an end, as in fighting, I'll still be involved. I'll hopefully still be marshalling. I'll hopefully still be training. I take no greater pleasure than actually seeing people that I've trained do things that they wouldn't have been able to do. You know, there was a tournament ran by Invicta last year called the Passage of Arms. It was in September, I think it was, down at their kind of training ground. Over 2 days. Day one was dueling. Day two was 3v3s. And it was aimed at newer fighters with lesser experience to get them in there. And seeing, you know, little Dan, who we shouted out before, go in there on 6 to 7 weeks worth of training and make it to the quarterfinals of his sword and shield dueling, when he'd only been training for such a short time, You feel like a proud father. Sounds really cliche, but across that weekend, it couldn't have been a better weekend. And it's that as well, the community and the family, building people. That's where I will be, hopefully, with more of a focus when my competitive time's over. But I've hopefully still got a few years left.
Got a tear coming on there. That's great. Well, your passion has really come across, and I can't think of a better person to represent your sport.
Thank you.
Than yourself. That was brilliant, Daniel.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to say, if you want more information, I'll put links below to the website and how to contact Daniel and everything like that. And I hope you really enjoyed this little glimpse into Buhurt.
Yep.
Thank you for watching.
Thank you very much.
See you all soon.
Thanks for watching, and why not check out the other videos in the HEMA playlist. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to the channel, and let me know what other HEMA related videos you would like to see next.